Hello class, Mr. Maynard or Jordan here with another weekly lecture video. I'm so glad you're here with me today, and today we're going to talk about a very important topic. We're going to talk about ableism. In this course so far, we've talked a lot about how our identities, things like race, gender, and class, help shape our experiences with society and the world. And we're going to continue to talk about those things. And we've also talked about how things such as implicit bias and microaggressions can help shape our own experience in society. Today we're talking about ableism, and ableism is another one of those critical lenses that we need to use to see how oppression and discriminatory practices can affect us, our friends, and society. So our goal today is to understand what ableism is, to see how it operates in the world, and to figure out what we can do to create a more inclusive and equitable spaces throughout society. Today's lecture will be drawing from your weekly readings, your videos, and some of my own personal lived experience. So without further ado, let's begin. What is ableism? Let's begin with a clear definition. Now, in the first article we read, ableism is defined, the first article that we read in the module this week, I should say, ableism is defined as stereotyping, prejudice, discrimination, and social oppression towards people with disabilities. However, it's very important that we make the distinction that ableism is not just an individual attitude. Ableism is a systemic issue that operates on multiple levels, whether that be the individual, the institutional, and the societal level. At its core, what ableism does is ableism creates what is called a corporal standard, or an imagined ideal of what a human body and a human mind should be. And that corporal idea becomes society's baseline of what's considered normal or fully human. And the problem with that is once you have that idealized perfect person, anyone who falls out of this narrow perfect standard is then seen as a diminished state of being human. And this is a crucial point, as you see, ableism often obscures the role of social and environmental barriers. That is to say that ableism often wants to blame the person for their challenges instead of society for the barriers it creates. Instead of recognizing that there are some buildings that are inaccessible for people with disabilities, or there's some policies that make life very difficult for people with disabilities, instead of recognizing that those might be the problem, instead, ableism likes to say, no, the policies in the building aren't the problem, you're the problem. It's not our fault that we don't have captions on our videos, it's your fault that you can't hear. I've heard that, ironically, pun intended, several times. And we can see this parallel, the way that ableism blames the person instead of blaming the barrier. We can see this in other forms of oppression as well, such as in racism, where when there's a lack of representation of people in color in leadership roles, it's often blamed on a person's individual qualifications rather than pointing out that there are systemic barriers and biases that have prevented people of color from being able to advance in that career. And that's just one example. So our main goal today is to shift our perspective from an ableist perspective. We want to shift our perspective from blaming the person to instead addressing the barriers that ableism has created. So, to really get a better idea of ableism, we need to understand that there are two different ways, generally, of thinking about disability. And the first is the medical model. And this is one that, unfortunately, most of us are probably familiar with. The medical model views disability as a problem or a pathology within an individual that needs to be fixed or cured. It places all the responsibility on the person with the disability. In contrast to the medical model, the social model is a key framework that has emerged in disability studies. You see, the social model argues that a person's impairment isn't the problem. It's society's inaccessibility and biases that create the disability. For example, a person who uses a wheelchair, and this is according to the social model, for example, a person who uses a wheelchair isn't inherently disabled by the wheelchair. Instead, they're disabled by a lack of ramps or a lack of elevators. This model places the responsibility on society to create a more inclusive world. We also use a broad definition of disability today, including people with visible, invisible, physical, mental, and chronic conditions. Anyone who identifies as part with this experience is part of the community. Now, I do want to make a note that this module section is mainly going to focus on physical disabilities. We'll talk about what other people consider to be invisible disabilities. And again, disability is a term we want to be careful with using, but for example, we'll talk about things such as neurodiversity in later modules. So, just to recap, two different models. Medical model, disability is an individual pathology. It's an abnormality. It's something that needs to be cured. It's something that needs to be fixed. There's something inherently wrong with the person. That is according to the medical model. The social model is instead, disability is seen as a social construction created by an inaccessible society and biased. Or better yet, it's a social construction created by barriers in society. So, another one of the articles that you're going to read this week is also going to talk about language. And language is important. Language matters. The words we use matter a lot. And in your readings this week, you're going to come across two common approaches to language. You're going to encounter person-first language and identity-first language. Person-first language always puts the person before their condition, like saying a person with a disability. The idea behind person-first language is that the person is more important than their disability. I've also heard it said that a person's identity shouldn't be based on their disability, and that's a perspective that person-first language uses. However, many in the disability community prefer identity-first language, like the term disabled person. You see, for them, their disability is a core and often celebrated part of who they are, much like a race or gender. This is especially true in groups like the deaf community, who see themselves as a cultural and linguistic minority. I can say a little bit on that. I know if you watched my introduction video, you know that I only have about 20 to 30% hearing, and I don't consider myself part of the deaf community, although I am severely hard of hearing because I grew up speaking and using English, and my first language wasn't sign language. But I do have many friends in the deaf community, and I will say that a lot of them choose identity-first language. They see being part of the deaf community as being part of their own culture, which I agree with. The deaf culture is a real and valid culture, and it's very important because things such as ASL or American Sign Language are part of that cultural identity. So, what do we do? Do we use person-first language or do we use identity-first language? The best rule of thumb is simply ask people what they prefer. If you don't know, using first-person language is usually a safe and respective default. What's most important is to avoid using old offensive terms and listen to what the community tells you. So again, the best rule of thumb, ask people what they prefer. And this goes with many things we're going to discuss in diversity and difference. The best rule of thumb, if at all possible, is to always ask people what they prefer. It's easy to overlook, and it's easy not to think about. But with nearly 1 in 5 people in the United States having a disability, disability is the largest minority group. As your readings point out this week, disability intersects with all our other identities. And that goes back to what we talked about the first week with intersectionality. Things like race and gender and sexual orientation all intersect with disability. This means, for example, a black woman with a disability might face multiple layers of discrimination instead of just facing one level of discrimination. And again, that all ties back into that intersectionality. We also see that disability can be connected to the larger concept of stigma, which is social devaluation based on a perceived difference. You see, stigma doesn't just feel bad. It has real and negative consequences. The constant experience of being stereotyped or facing discrimination, called minority stress, can lead to psychological distress and poor health outcomes. And this kind of ties into what we were talking about a few weeks ago with those microaggressions. It's that cumulative stress that continues to hurt people. I know several of you in your reflections pointed out that was the most surprising part of microaggressions, just that it continued to happen and how draining that was. And that ties into that minority stress. Sadly, a common stereotype is that people with disabilities are often seen as warm but incompetent, which often leads them to being ignored or underestimated. We need to be aware of these harmful stereotypes and try to actively work against them. With those stereotypes in mind, let's see how dangerous they can be. Let's look at a modern day example. In 2020, we all experienced the COVID-19 pandemic. And as one of the articles you'll read this week reveals, the pandemic highlighted deadly discrimination within our own healthcare systems. When hospitals faced ventilator shortages, many states took that time to create policies that explicitly or implicitly disadvantaged people with disabilities. They used criteria like intellectual disability, dementia, or a person's pre-illness functional status to decide who would get a ventilator. And the problem is, this created a false choice, suggesting we either had to save some lives or discriminate against others. But as disability advocates pointed out, these policies were not objective. They were based on subjective, ableist judgments about a person's perceived quality of life or worth, which is a dangerous and discriminatory mindset. Excuse me. This isn't just an unfortunate outcome. It is a clear example of systemic ableism directly impacting people's access to resources and their fundamental human rights. And basically this shows us that ableism was able to construct it to where, since people with disabilities did not meet that corporal identity, that idealized version of a person, because people with disabilities violated the norm of what a perfect person should look like, they were considered less than. And because they were considered less than, their quality of life was considered inferior to those who were not considered less than. And thus, they were considered individuals who were less than worthy of a ventilator. Again, this is what we have to fight against. This is what we have to work against in our terms of policy. And something I hope you garner from this class is these are the type of policies we have to step in and say, hey, is everything being objective here, or are we being subjective? Fortunately, the disability community does not stay silent. During COVID, they fought back. Using powerful civil rights laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act or the ADA, disability organizations filed formal complaints against these discriminatory ventilator policies. This advocacy was so effective that the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services had to step in. They issued a bulletin reminding states that it is illegal to deny care based on disability or perceived worth. This pressure has already led to several states, like Alabama and Louisiana, changing their policies. This example shows us the power of advocacy in promoting equality and holding institutions accountable. It's a perfect illustration of how individuals and groups can challenge systems of oppression and fight for change. Now that we've talked about some of the more systemic and macro policy and advocacy that takes place regarding ableism and disability, let's look at more of our daily lives in the micro level. One of the articles you're going to read this week is called The Disability Etiquette. And I love this article because it gives us a great set of guidelines when interacting with people to foster respectful interactions. Now, there's several key principles. The first being, and the most important, do not assume. You can't know a person's needs or experiences just by looking at them. The best way is to interact is to be respectful and never assume. Another key principle is to always ask before you act. If you see someone who might need help, just ask them, "Can I help you?" And then listen to their instructions. That's very important. Don't assume, so don't go ahead and try to help them. Simply ask, and then importantly, listen to what they say. Another important principle is to speak directly to the person. Don't talk to their companion or interpreter as if that person with a disability is not there. I don't know, there's been a few times that I've been in restaurants and I'll having my hearing aids or have them out, and I'll be talking to my wife or signing, or the waiter will walk up and see that I have a hard time hearing. And the waiter will often look at my wife and go, "What does he want?" To which my wife often responds, "Probably to have a conversation with your manager." Do not do that. Always speak directly to the person. Even if there's an interpreter there, you still need to speak to the person. Another important principle is to respect personal space. A wheelchair, a cane, or any other assistive device is an extension of their body. Don't lean on it without permission. I'm going to go ahead and take an extra moment to say that also goes along with service animals. Most service animals are working animals, so you shouldn't just try to pet them. Finally, another very important principle is to get on a person's level. If you're talking with someone in a wheelchair for a while, it's polite and considerate to find a chair and sit down. You don't want to always be standing over them and trying to talk to them. Finally, just like you do in every interaction you have with everyone, have empathy and patience. Be encouraging, give full attention. And again, these aren't complicated rules. They're just ways of showing respect and empathy, which is, at the heart of this class. As we wrap up, I want to leave you with some questions for reflection during this module. Think about your own social identity and biases. How might they influence the way you perceive disability? Next, what are some small but actionable steps that you can take to challenge ableism in your daily life? And finally, how can you become a better ally to the disability community? I'd like you to think on those questions as you work through this week's material. Or if you've already worked through the material and you're just watching this, then take some time and think on it. And to summarize, here are the key things to remember, the key takeaways from this lecture. Number one, ableism is systemic discrimination. It is a systemic issue and not just a personal one. Disability is a diverse identity. It's not a problem to be fixed. Our language and our actions have real impact, so we should always lead with respect and empathy. Advocacy is crucial for fighting for human rights. And finally, every one of us has a role to play in creating a more inclusive society. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy this week's module.